To another IB biology video. Today we're going to be talking all about the circulatory system, specifically the heart. I actually really enjoy anatomy, so I've had a great time this unit. So hopefully I can bring a little bit of that joy back into your life with this unit. Oh, I know you're just thrilled. I am thrilled too. So I have a list in front of me, as usual, of class objectives and IB assessment statements. I'll be reading them and discussing them, and as usual, feel free to put the video on 1.5 or 2 times speed so that you can get through it much faster. I'm hoping this doesn't take long because we only have one topic to cover instead of several. That's also the reason I've decided to do an older version of my recordings versus using handwritten notes. Just because I think this lends itself much better to the old version. There's a lot to say, not a lot to write, not a lot that benefits from me showing it visually, but I do have a picture of a beautiful heart here, so I will be talking about the different parts to that as well. So look forward to that. Our first statement is that William Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood with the heart acting as a pump. So prior to William Harvey, we didn't really understand the whole function of the circulatory system, the veins, the arteries, the heart. We thought maybe it had something to do with heat, which it does, but it's not its entire job. So William Harvey did a whole bunch of experiments in which he learned a lot about, he started hypothesizing about capillaries, and he learned about kind of the benefits of having veins in our body, how much blood the heart could hold, and how much pressure it could be under, and how it pumped, and all these things were all due to a man named William Harvey. This was kind of his role in the discovery of the blood circulation, so that is the first statement. So then we go into talking about the arteries, the veins, blood clots, coronary arteries, a lot of good stuff like that. So first, before we do that, I think we're just going to start out with this beautiful diagram I have in front of you here. So we're going to be looking at a lot of diagrams of the heart. And so there are some things that you should remember when we look at them, okay? So first of all, imagine that I draw a person with his head up here and his feet down here, and this is his heart. If we look at this as his heart and we just push it back and pretend this is in a person, this is exactly how we would see it head on, right? So this is in the person's chest, this is how the heart looks. Because of that, the picture is actually going to be swapped, quote unquote, with the left and right. It will be by the person who has the heart. It will be from their point of view, which means that anytime you look at a diagram of a heart, like this one here, the left side of the heart is going to be over here, and the right side of the heart is going to be over here. Does that make sense? So that's why we have labels over here for right when they are on the quote-unquote left side. So this is going to be the right side of the heart, and this is going to be the left side of the heart. So let's get on to some important anatomy. So the heart has 4 chambers. You've probably heard that before. These 4 chambers consist of 2 atria and 2 ventricles. The atria are always going to be on the top. Think A, top. Again, we're going to have the left atria over on the right top side and the right atria over on the left top side. The atria are going to have significantly less muscle than the ventricle, and I will talk about why in just a few minutes, but before that, let's talk about the ventricles. These are the other 2 chambers of the hearts, and they're located directly below the atrium. So we have over here the left ventricle, and over here the right ventricle. Makes sense. So when we have these 2 sides of the heart, you might be thinking to yourself, why do we need both sides? That doesn't make any sense. Who cares? Well, in humans, we have what is called, we have like a two-way system. So in fish, they only have a single circulation. But in humans, and that's what we're looking at here, a human heart, we have a left side and a right side. So the right side is going to be the right side is going to be over here. The right side is going to be receiving blood directly from the body. It's going to be part of that pulmonary circulation system. And it is going to be low in oxygen, so deoxygenated. When you see drawings, it might be blue. The blood is not actually blue, but it will be drawn blue to indicate that there's not a lot of oxygen. In reality, if you looked at blood from this part of the circulatory system, it might be slightly darker in color to blood from the systemic system, which we'll get there in a minute. So on the right side, which again is on the left, on the right side, we're going to have that pulmonary circulation. It's going to be colored blue on diagrams. It's going to be coming in from the body. It's going to be low in oxygen, and we are going to be pumping it out to the lungs. So let's just picture ourselves a human. So we have some blood coming in from the body. It just did all this hard work. It's deoxygenated. It might come in through the superior vena cava, which is called the superior vena cava because superior is higher than inferior. We also have the inferior vena cava. Both the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava will take in blood from the pulmonary circulation, blood that is deoxygenated, and that will deliver it to the left or to the right atria or the right atrium. So into here, right? So that blood is going to be low in oxygen. What we do is that blood will then, when the atria contracts, when both atria contracts, when the atrium contracts, that blood will be pushed down into the ventricle. What we have here is called a valve. A valve is like a one-way gateway. The door only swings open to let the blood from the atrium into the ventricle. But when the ventricle contracts, that blood is not going to be able to make it back up into the atrium. That's because the doorway or the valve will close. This valve is going to be the same as this valve here in terms of name. It's going to be called the atrioventricular valve or the AV valve. All right, so they both have the same function. You might see that this one is a tricuspid valve and this is the mitral valve. You don't need to know that. If you are taking the exam in May 2022, or if your choice is not the human body, then you don't need to know that, so we don't need to know that. But let's go back to our example. So we bring in the blood from the body, it's deoxygenated, it goes into the right atrium, the right atrium pushes it through that AV valve and into the right ventricle. When that right ventricle contracts, it's going to send it up through this semilunar valve and out through the pulmonary artery. Okay? So we have the left and the right, but that's not as important as knowing that the pulmonary artery is going to be part of the deoxygenated side, or the right side of the heart. After it goes out from the heart and to the lungs through that pulmonary artery, we know that is going to be taken to the lungs where it's going to be oxygenated and all that good stuff, and then it's going to come back around. So it's either going to come in through these pulmonary veins here on the right or these pulmonary veins here on the left. These pulmonary veins are going to deliver this now oxygenated red blood, red color in diagram in the blood as part of the systemic circulation system into the left atrium, left atrium. When the left atrium contracts, it's going to push it through that atrioventricular valve, that AV valve, into the left ventricle. When that left ventricle contracts, it's going to send it through a semilunar valve that you can't see very well in this diagram, but it's right about there. And it'll send it up into the aorta. The aorta is an artery. So you might be thinking to yourself right now, I don't know the difference between arteries and veins. I don't think there's a difference. There is a difference, and we'll talk about it later, but the most important difference to recognize between veins and arteries is that arteries are always going to be taking blood away from the heart. So aorta also starts with A, and artery starts with A for away. It's going to take it away from the heart. So in this case, the pulmonary artery is taking blood away from the heart, and the aorta is taking blood away from the heart. And that might go to someplace like the liver or the brain, and it might use up its oxygen there and then come back around and cycle back through the vena cava, which the vena cava is a vein. We know because veins always bring blood to the heart. So arteries are away and veins are to the heart. All right? So that's your very, very basic overview. So again, we have those two semilunar valves, those two atrioventricular valves, and they will always work in the sense that once the blood has gone through, it cannot come back. They are one-sided, one-way gateway. That's how valves work, okay? Always. One way, one way, one way, one way. Now that we've generally gone over the simple, very simple, sorry, what was that? The very simple anatomy of the heart, let's go back to our statements. So, arteries convey blood at high pressure from the ventricles to the tissues of the body. So the function of these arteries, I'm changing my mind again. Let's talk about so I have here just pulled up pulmonary circulation deoxygenated away from the heart to the lungs, and then oxygenated blood back to the heart. And then the systemic is the cardiovascular, oxygenated blood away and the deoxygenated blood back, right? Makes sense, makes sense, makes sense. So heart to lungs and back, heart to body and back. Heart to lungs and back, heart to body and back. Wonderful. Now that we've established that, let's move ourselves along. So, I have here 3 diagrams, one of an artery, one of a vein, and one of a capillary. So let's start with the artery. Arteries are always going to be taking blood away from the heart, away, away, away. Arteries are going to have a significant amount of smooth muscle here that we can see. This smooth muscle is going to aid in the extremely high pressure that they'll have to deal with when they are taking blood away from the heart, because the ventricles, as we see here, have a lot more muscles than the atria, and that's because the atria both are aided in some way by gravity, so gravity is already helping to pull that blood into the ventricle. They don't need to push the blood as far. Instead of sending it all the way to the lungs or all the way to the body, they're just sending it from the atria down to their respective ventricle. But the ventricle have a much tougher job. So they have a lot of muscle mass there, and they are going to put those arteries under a high pressure because that push of that blood is going to be so strong. So the arteries are going to be having a somewhat small lumen. A lumen is what we call that area that's empty, or that would be, in this case, filled with blood. So arteries are going to be having a somewhat small lumen, but they're going to be having a lot of that smooth muscle around them because they are going to have to deal with those high pressure scenarios. They are going to deal with, we'll see later on here, they are going to have to deal with elastic recoil. So when the heart pumps, that pumping is going to cause this pressure to push against that smooth muscle, to push against the walls, to make that lumen a little bigger. When that happens, the muscle is going to do something called elastic recoil, where it pushes it back. That force back is going to help propel the blood forward, right? This is another benefit of the artery, having that muscle there. The veins are always going to be taking blood back to the heart, right? So the veins are not going to be it's not going to be as high pressure. They're going to have a much larger lumen, and you're often going to find them around cardiac muscles. That would be like the muscle in your calves or the muscle in your forearm. It's much more likely to be there than anywhere else. So you might be thinking to yourself, why? Why are they near those types of muscles? And why do they have this valve that we can see here? It looks kind of pearly in this picture. Because veins are not as high pressure, it can be harder for the blood to move through the veins, right? So it is much more likely than it is in an artery for the blood to want to go through and go back. But because of this valve, that prevents it from going through and coming back. Also, because these veins are near these cardiac muscles, moving those muscles or flexing those muscles is going to aid in adding more pressure to the veins and helping to push that blood through. So the last thing that we have here is a capillary. Capillaries are only one cell thick. They're very, very thin, and their main job is diffusion of material, usually water. It can also be something like waste, like carbon dioxide. It can also be nutrients and minerals and all that good stuff. We usually think of the main thing being water. They do a lot of things. They can go to different parts of the body, right up to the top of your skin, and they distribute their things that they need to drop off, basically. And that's the job of the capillary. So now that we've talked about the function of arteries, we've kind of outlined the role of elastic and muscle tissue in arteries, I would say. We've established the reason for the toughness in the artery walls. Our next statement is that arteries have muscle cells and elastic fibers in their walls. We've kind of talked about why. There are 3 layers. There's the inside layer, the kind of stretchy, elastic membrane, and then the smooth muscle. I would say that we accomplished that. Our next statement is the muscle and elastic fibers assist in maintaining blood pressure between pump cycles. So that goes back to what we were talking about over here with the pulse flow and then the elastic recoil. So because they are able to deal with this pressure here, and then from this pressure, put more pressure on the blood to force it forward, that helps to maintain blood pressure, because if we just had pressure coming from the pumping of the artery and then the ventricle, mainly from the ventricle, that would probably not be enough to push our blood all the way through our body and maintain blood pressure that keeps pressure on the blood cells. So because of this pulse flow and elastic recoil, that helps to do that. So let's talk about systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So I don't know that I necessarily have a really good picture. Well, maybe I do. Let's see. Oh, really quick. Artery, lots of muscle. Vein, lots of lumen. Just to establish that. Yeah, okay. This is fine. Let's talk about systolic and diastolic. Yeah, I'll start here. So, artery, ventricle, we can see that the ventricles have more smooth muscle, right? Great. Now that we've established that, let's move on. So, we used, when talking about the pumping of the heart, we use 2 big sciencey words, systolic and diastolic. Systolic is going to be when the pressure is on, the pumping is happening. That is going to be when we have systolic action in the atrium or in the ventricle. So that's when they're squishing, that's when they're pressing down, that's when they're forcing the blood to move. Great? Great. We also have this word diastole. Diastole is basically going to mean the same thing as being at rest. So we are going to have 3 main times when we talk about the pumping of the heart. We're going to have atrial systole, which is going to be when the atrium is contracting. We're going to have ventricular systole, which is when the ventricles are contracting. And we're going to have ventricular diastole. Not ventricular diastole. It would be cardiac diastole, which is the same as when passive filling would occur. So let's start with passive filling. So picture this. Everybody's at rest. We're all taking a breather. blood is coming in through the vena cavas or the pulmonary veins and into the atrium. That AV valve, once there's enough pressure naturally from the flow of blood, that AV valve, the atrioventricular valve, is naturally going to push itself open, and the blood is going to start to fill up into the ventricle. Right? This is called cardiac diastole because both the atrium and the ventricle are at rest. They're just hanging out. Blood is coming in. Starts in the atrium again. That AV valve is naturally going to be closed. When there's enough weight or pressure from the blood that has naturally come into the atrium, it will naturally open into that ventricle, and then the whole heart will fill with blood. This is called passive filling because nobody is contracting, nobody's pushing. The heart is just naturally filling with blood. Then we move on to what is called atrial systole. Atrial systole is when the atrium is going to contract. So this is going to, again, that AV valve is still going to be open. The atrium is going to contract, and the blood is going to stop being in the atrium, and it's going to push into the ventricle. So this pressure in the ventricle is then going to cause what is called ventricular systole. Keep in mind, during ventricular systole, the atria are in diastole, which means they're at rest. They're no longer contracting. Up here, the ventricles were in diastole, while the atria were in systole. Here, it's the other way around. The ventricles are in systole, and the atria are in diastole. When the ventricles contract, they're going to snap close those AV valves, and they're going to push open those semilunar valves. And this is going to force the blood out through the arteries or out through the aorta, which is still an artery, I should say, but we call it the aorta, right? This is also a part known as ejection. So that's when the ventricles are pushing the blood out. So it's important to keep in mind that after this happens, once the ventricles go back into diastole, we're going to have a phase of ventricular diastole where the semilunar valves up here are going to close again, and the aorta and the arteries are going to do that pulse thing and the recoil thing, and they're going to be the ones pushing the blood now that there's been enough pressure. We can see this again here. The blood comes in. We have we have passive filling or atrial systole where the atrium pushes. Then we have ventricular systole where the ventricles push. And then we have ventricular diastole, cardiac diastole. Everybody's just chilling, right? So if you want another way to look at this, here is a very brief chart. Feel free to pause and take note of this chart if this is helpful to you. It's the same information I just went over, but yeah. So again, if you want a better visual of what the blood is going to be doing, it comes in. It's going to go down into the ventricles. Then it's going to push down from the ventricles up into and through the semilunar valves and then out through the arteries. So let's go back to, we can keep it on this diagram. Let me go back to our statements. Ahem. So we've explained the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure. We've identified blood vessels as arteries, capillaries, or veins from the structure of their walls. Again, capillaries are going to be very, very tiny, very, very thin. Veins are going to have a huge lumen. They're going to have valves. They're going to have a very thin wall, and arteries are going to have that thick, thick wall of muscle. All right. So, blood flows through tissues in capillaries. Capillaries have permeable walls that allow exchange of materials between cells in the tissue and the blood in the capillary. So the structure and function of capillaries are going to have that one cell thick wall. They're going to be diffusing materials We got it. Veins collect blood at low pressure from the veins of the body and return it to the atria of the heart. So again, veins are going to be at low pressure. They're going to be aided by the cardiac muscles. They're going to be aided by those valves, and they're going to bring that blood back to the heart. That's their function. Gravity, they're really working against gravity for the most part, and that's why we have the help of the skeletal muscular pressure or those cardiac muscles in maintaining flow of blood. So we're trying to prevent, in a lot of these cases, backflows. The reasons why those valves close is so that there's no backflow back into the atria. The reason why we have valves in general is to prevent backflow. So backflow is just when blood goes back to where it was before. We never want that. That's not good. We want one direction. And that's the purpose of valves. And that's the same as valves and veins. Valves and veins in the heart ensure circulation of blood by preventing backflow. So we've got that. So let's talk about coronary arteries, shall we? It's before this. Coronary arteries. So we've talked about providing oxygen and other nutrients and minerals to other parts of the body, but the heart also needs those. The heart also needs those nutrients and minerals and oxygen and all that good stuff. So the coronary arteries are going to be what we see here. They're going to be on the outside of the heart, smaller. We know the drill. When we did a dissection of a sheep heart, we were able to see that the coronary arteries were kind of like surrounded by fat because they're going to be the ones supplying oxygen, nutrients, minerals, all the good stuff. They're the ones supplying it to the heart. So when these arteries are not having as much luck and they're struggling to supply these nutrients, coronary artery disease has the possibility of occurring. Coronary occlusion. So coronary occlusion is going to be when cholesterol, which is essentially just fat, builds up in those arteries. So specifically in those coronary arteries, the ones sending blood and oxygen and nutrients and minerals and all the good stuff to the heart, they will begin to fill up here. We can see the cholesterol building up, narrowing that lumen. So here it's kind of a decent size, but as we start to build up, that lumen is going to get much smaller. This is going to put a lot of extra pressure on those arteries because instead of having all that room in the lumen to kind of even out the pressure, it's all going to be condensed right there, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on those arteries. And what's going to happen is when that plaque builds up high enough to stop the blood, a blood clot can form, and that's going to block the artery, and that's when we're going to have some of that backflow, and it's going to prevent the oxygen and nutrients and minerals from getting to that part of the heart, and that's going to cause dead tissue. So that's why you really need to prevent blood clots from happening because they can cause basically the inside of one of your organs to start dying because there's not enough spread of oxygen and whatnot there. And that's fine and well for some. Well, it's not fine and well for anybody. But the problem with cardiac muscles is that cardiac muscles cannot regenerate. So the cardiac muscle you've got now is going to be the cardiac muscle you've got for basically the rest of your life. It's not going to regenerate at a rate that's going to help you survive this coronary occlusion situation. Sorry. Again, with most things, we're going to have very typical heart disease factors. If you need to name these, basically think, what's a bad thing that I shouldn't be doing? And write it down. Don't get sick. Don't smoke. Don't have alcohol. Don't be obese. Don't eat unhealthy. Stress, sedentary lifestyle, and age are all going to be factors. And of course, genetic predisposition is also going to place you at a higher risk. Do any of these things absolutely 100% if you smoke once you will get coronary occlusion? That's not how it works. But if asked to name some of the risk factors, those would be some of the risk factors. So we've kind of talked about how there's a separate circulation for the lungs, whereas fishies don't have that same situation. They've got just one where it goes from the gills to the body and back to the heart, into the gills, into the body, and back to the heart, and blah, blah, blah. But we have two sides to our heart, and so we have from the heart to the lungs, to the heart, to the body, to the heart, to the lungs, to the body, to the, I'm like messing this up, whoa. From the heart to the lungs, to the heart, to the body. From the heart to the lungs, to the heart, to the body. If you made sense of any of that, you get a gold star for the day, because that was complicated. And again, that pulmonary system is going to be is going to always be handling deoxygenated blood, and is, for God's sake. Here we go. The pulmonary circulation is going to be taking deoxygenated to the lungs and back. The systemic circuit is going to be taking oxygenated to the blood to the body and deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So the difference here is pulmonary, lungs, systemic, body system, right? We can remember that. So in this way, there's a double circulation system because it's going to the heart and then to the lungs and back to the heart before going to the body. If we wanted to compare that to fish, we can see here that it's just going from the heart to the gills to the body, to the heart to the gills to the body. And then again, the gills is where they're going to get their oxygen and whatnot. Good stuff. Good stuff. And we have to have that double heart system because, like, our body is huge. We have a giant body that we need to supply a lot to. Anyways, we need the pressure. We need the added pressure. The fish don't. So we've already talked about which valves and chambers and arteries and veins are on the diagram of the heart. We've already explained the pressure changes, but what I do want to look at before we move on too far is one of these bad boys. So let's do this one. So what you have in front of you here is basically a cardiac diagram. I don't like that it just names. Let's do this. This one's better. All right. It's going to show you the cardiac cycle, basically. So you are going to have 3 or 4, usually 3 lines. The smallest one with the least pressure is always going to be your atrium. It usually picks one side. That side is usually the left, but it basically has no difference from the right and the left. The line that starts low pressure, jumps up and jumps back down, that's going to be your ventricle. And the last one at the top here is going to be your aorta, and that's how it's going to be every time. So what are the important things that you need to be able to glean from something like this? Well, the first would be the systole and diastole patterns of both the atrium and the ventricle. So on most graphs, they're going to look something closer to this, and you're not going to be given where each part starts and ends. But for now, let's look at this. This little blip here, right before the ventricle spikes, this blip is going to be when the atrium is in systole. So that's when the atrium is contracting. The pressure is going to go up very slightly, and then it's going to jump right back down. In the time when it jumps down right before the ventricle jumps up, that's going to be when your AV valve, your atrioventricular valve that's between the atrium and the ventricle, that's when that is going to close. When we go back over here, when the two paths cross again, that's when it's going to open back up. and that's when you're going to have passive filling all the way up until this blip. If you want to talk about the systole of the ventricle, that's going to be the entire time it's spiking and until that aortic valve closes. So how do you know when that happens? Well, when you look at when the paths cross the first time, that's going to be when the aortic valve opens. When they cross the second time and they separate again, that's when the aortic valve closes. That's when systole is going to end for the ventricle. All right? So again, AV valve close, open, aortic valve open, close. That's just how it is on the diagram. They're doing opposite things at opposite times. Keep in mind that they're not going to line up exactly, but that's generally what you want to look for. So let's talk a little bit more about the heartbeat and how it happens. So we've mentioned how the heart contracts. We haven't so much mentioned the heartbeat itself. So let's talk about why. So we have in our brain stem has this part called the medulla. This is going to be in control of signals through a nerve that is either going to be telling our heart to speed up contracting and pump more often, or to slow its roll and chill out. We also have a hormone called adrenaline, and there's another one called epinephrine. These are also going to be hormones that tell our heart to speed up. They cannot tell our heart to slow back down, because when there is no more hormone, naturally the heart will slow back down. Those are the two main parts that contribute outside of the heart to whether it speeds up or slows down, is the hormones, adrenaline and epinephrine. The adrenaline is from the adrenal gland, of course. Adrenaline, adrenal, we get it. And then we also have that medulla, that part of the brainstem that is going to tell whether or not we need to speed up or slow down. Inside the heart, we have this node called the sinus node, or we call it the SA node. This SA node is going to be responsible for sending the signal to the rest of the heart when to pump. Our heart cells are called myogenic. That means they're naturally wanting to be contracting and relaxing. But when they're not being told when to contract and relax, although they'll do it at the same time, there won't be any real logic to it. That's the job of this sinus node, is to put some logic to the natural myogenic contractions of the heart. It will send out an electrical pulse to the atrium and this atrioventricular node. If you were curious earlier about why the atria contract first and the ventricles contract after, it is all thanks to this system. So when the sinus node sends out this electrical pulse, it is going to cause the atrium to contract at the same time it's telling that atrioventricular node to tell the ventricle to contract. That's where that delay occurs. Basically, it's like playing telephone, and the ventricles need to have someone extra on their side to call. So the sinus node sends out a signal causing the atrium to contract and telling the atrioventricular node to tell the ventricles to contract, at which point, once the atria are relaxing, that atrioventricular node are sending the signal through the bundle branches into the ventricles, causing them to contract. So it's again, that SA node is going to be working as like a pacemaker. You might have heard of a pacemaker. It goes in the heart. It does the job of the SA node. And it's going to be telling the heart, it's going to be putting some sort of a logic to those myogenic tendencies. And with that, I believe we've done it all. The only other thing that I have here that I haven't really covered at all is just that epinephrine increases the heart rate to prepare for vigorous physical activity, but that would make sense to you. Your heart rate is going to beat faster when you're doing physical activity. That's epinephrine's job. If you are really scared or in need of a situation like that, that's when your adrenaline is going to be dealing with it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned everything you need for your test. Good luck, and see you next time.